Hi, I'm God. You get asked me.
Was life objectively better than 2000s, or did it just seem like that because I was a kid and I still had joy? I mean, I really went down the rabbit hole with this, and I'm not just talking about the obvious ones like, CGI, which has somehow gotten worse, even though the technology has gotten better. Marvel, superhero movies, Star Wars, they've all gotten worse. I mean, it's everything.
I only get excited to go to movies if it's sort of like, one of 4 remaining quality directors. Timothy Chalamet, Austin Butler, Pedro Pascal are the leads in every new movie, and I can't get away from it. Comedy movies, I mean, holy f***, if you watched a comedy movie that came out in the 2000s, half the time you're laughing your ass off, the other half the time you're thinking, how the f*** did they get away with this? Animation, I still haven't seen animated movies good. Shrek, Monsters, Inc., Incredibles, and I'm not just talking animation-wise, which is definitely better. I'm talking story, like, they were legit good movies. And children's animation, my god, I mean, if I ever have kids, I'm showing them SpongeBob. I'm not letting them watch any of that new shit that's coming out nowadays. I mean...
Yes.
Alright, so a common complaint that people have nowadays is that movies are just not good anymore. And this is not anything new, honestly. I've been hearing about this my whole life, for like at least the last 15 years. And while I can sympathize and understand where people are coming from with this viewpoint, I wanted to take a step back and look at this objectively and see what the statistics actually say. According to the numbers, are movies actually worse today than they were back in the olden days? For this video, I've gone through over a century of data to find out, so lock in guys. This video will be featuring a lot of numbers, a lot of charts and graphs, so please stick with me, because I promise you that by the end of this video, the numbers will tell an interesting story. So, let's see. Personal biases aside, are movies actually better or worse nowadays? Let's find out. Alright, so first, some methodology. So, what I did is I tracked the top 10 highest grossing movies per year, according to the US box office, and I basically averaged their letterbox ratings in order to get an overall rating for that year. So, the reason why I went with the top 10 highest grossing movies is because, I mean, you can cherry pick data to come up with whatever narrative you want. If you want to say, well, actually, movies today are great, you can, find some indie movie that no one's ever heard of that's really good as your proof. But if no one has ever seen that movie besides a very niche audience, then that's not really going to be part of the overall cultural zeitgeist, so it doesn't really matter at that point. And the same goes for the opposite. If you want to say, well, actually, in the past they had bad movies too, and you pick out some random B movie from the 80s, then, well, yeah, I mean, obviously every year is going to have good movies and bad movies, but we're focusing on the top box office earners because that's going to be the movies that were actually popular at the time. These are the movies that people actually watched, and so this is, for better or worse, this is what's informing people's opinions on how good or bad movies are at any given time. And the reason why I'm choosing Letterboxd is it's a random thing. You could choose Rotten Tomatoes, although I don't trust Rotten Tomatoes or, IMDb or whatever, but I'm just personally comfortable with Letterboxd, so that's what we're going to be using. So to start off, in the 1920s, this is the first decade that we're going through, and we'll be going through decade by decade first, and then at the end we'll take a step back and look at the overall picture. So as you can see on this chart, I've labeled a green arrow and a red arrow. So the green arrow is at 3.6 average rating, and the red arrow is a 3.3 average rating. So anything above the green arrow, these are the green line, I should say, this is supposed to be a really good year, and anything in red is supposed to be a really bad year. And I have some other information here, so like average for the decade, 3.31, franchise fare, 4 films, that's, sequels and remakes and all that. Great movies, 3.9 or better, awful movies, 2.9 or worse. We're not going to be focusing too much on this extra information, it's just kind of here for you to look at. I have some other slides later that summarizes all this, but first we're just going to be looking at the overall trend line. And so as you can see, The 1920s, nothing was really too spectacular. You had a couple of years that were in the red, 1 year in the green. And then it just drops off in 1929. I guess the stock market's not the only thing that crashed in 1929.
Why, I haven't been that entertained since the stock market crash of 1929. So many orphans.
And I'm gonna be real. This 2.66, this is just freaking terrible. An individual movie having a score of 2.6 on Letterboxd is considered terrible. Much less 10 movies averaging this. I'm gonna play some spoilers here. This is 1929 is the worst year in movie history. So, well, we got that out of the way. If things are bad now, it hasn't been as bad as 1929. I guess a little bit of explanation is required for why the sudden drop off here in 1929. So, talkies were introduced in 1927, right? But it took a couple years for studios to really make the switch because, you know, obviously theaters were not built for talkies initially. So by 1929, though, things had changed. The technology had been implemented where talkies had become the norm as opposed to silent movies. Like this all back here, this is in the silent era. The reason why these early talkies tanked so hard in quality is, I think, one, because filmmakers were just not used to the technology yet. A lot of these early talkies, they're pretty rough.
How funny. I wonder if I've fallen right through the earth. And if this is the antithesis.
A lot of them were clearly made still by people who were used to making silent movies. Like if you were to just take away the talking part of it and add intertitles, these would still be basically silent movies, but now they had talking in it because that was what the box office draw. And one of the biggest box office draws of early talkies was musicals, because obviously you couldn't do musicals in the silent era because they were, you know, silent.
Silence!
But in 1929, musicals became super popular in this, you know, early talkie era because that's what audiences wanted. It was new, it was fresh. The thing is that these musicals have not aged well at all.
You know why we've gathered around the fair feast, but my wandering boy is coming home. Now our hearts will never, never be heavy if you stay and promise not to roam.
And studios were just pumping them out regardless of quality because it was a box office draw. I'm pretty sure all of the box office hits of 1929, at least 9 out of 10, if not 10 out of 10, it was all musicals, and they just have not aged well. So yeah, this early talkie era, it was rough, but it was a learning curve. I'm gonna treat this as an anomaly, so don't read too much into it, but this definitely does drag the overall average for the decade down. So for the 1930s, as you can see, picking up in 1930 where we left off with 1929. Yeah, the early talkies, they're still kind of sucky, but things are definitely getting better to the point where by mid-decade we're back in this sort of average range between 3.3 and 3.6. 1939, this is considered the classic answer for when the best year in movies is, although statistically, spoiler alert, there are going to be quite a few better years than 1939 coming up. But 1939 is kind of like the first great year in movies. You had Gone with the Wind, The Wizard of Oz, Stagecoach, the third Frankenstein movie, Son of Frankenstein. Just a lot of classics. Mr. Smith Goes to Washington. Yeah, a lot of classics came out in 1939. It was a pretty good year. So then in the 1940s, now we're getting into sort of the war years. And nothing too spectacular really happens. Of course, in the early 40s, you had a lot of propaganda films, for lack of a better word. A lot of effort was just put into the war effort, and so as a result, I mean, movies didn't really suffer too much outside of a couple years, was a little bit lackluster, but there just wasn't the energy in the film industry to make great films, it seems. All the energy was obviously put to more important use at the time. Now in the 1950s, we're getting into sort of the golden years of Hollywood, as they say, where, I mean, a lot of years in that average range, but we don't have anything below the red line. But we are starting to see some go way up into above the green. In 1959, 3.82. Okay, that's pretty darn good. And it's hard to get much better than that. So definitely the best decade so far, and we keep going. So the 1960s, we start off again. We're kind of in that average for the most part in the early part of the 60s, although we're in the sort of upper average, and then in the late 60s, things take off. We are well above the green line, and well, that trend just continues into the 70s. Look at all that green. All right, 1970, 71, 72, 73, all above the green. 74 is average, 75 back above the green. 76 is kind of an anomaly. It's right at the red line, but it gets better after that. So basically late 60s, early 70s, we're seeing a lot of green here. Things are looking up for sure. And then this really surprised me. I have an affinity for the 80s. I kind of like the 80s vibe, but really, statistically speaking, the 80s were kind of a mid-decade. Nothing was below the red line, nothing was above the green line. Everything was just kind of average. So I thought, that was pretty interesting. There's nothing really too exciting to say about the 80s. The 90s, we, start off the 90s pretty strong, actually. Everything is right at the green line, either right above it or right below it. So we're, starting off pretty good. 1998, that's kind of an anomaly. Of course, in 1998, you had a lot of disaster flicks that were really big, like Armageddon, Godzilla, Deep Impact, and, let's be honest, these movies, they're entertaining, but they're not exactly what would get you a really high score. It's entertainment. People like them. There's no shame in liking them, but these movies definitely drag down the letterbox ratings. Then in the 2000s, honestly, for the first part of the decade, we're doing okay. It's all in the average range, upper average even. But then the late 2000s, things kind of start to take a turn. We got a red year here in 2007, but even the average, blue years, we're kind of on that lower end where it's starting to trend downwards. And the 2010s, as you can see, that trend, it just continues. We're continuing downwards. We got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 red years. So 5 years out of 10 in the 2010s. So half of the 2010s is considered sort of kind of bad years, and then the other half are just average. So the good years of the 2010s weren't really great. They were just okay. And the 2020s. Of course, we all know what happened in 2020. We're way below the red line, 2.92. That is the worst single year that we've had since that infamous 1929 year that we talked about earlier. But, obviously, we all remember it. There were reasons for it. COVID, it wiped out basically a whole movie season where the only movies that made it to theaters in 2020 were kind of the movies that studios just wanted to dump. And, they're holding their better stuff for later, hopefully, once, everything opened back up. And you can see this as the decade has gone along. Things just, got back more to normal. More normal movies were being released, on a normal schedule, and things got better. But yeah, this was a rough time. So a lot like this previous stretch in the early talkie era, 1929, 1930, where there was an obvious external reason for why movie quality tanked. I mean, here we have another obvious external reason. So the absolute worst times in movie history, it does appear that it requires some extra help and not just general incompetence. But now that we've gone through the 1920s through the 2020s, let's look at the overall picture and actually see that general trend over the last 100 years. So this is the decade by decade averages. And yes, as you can see, things started off kind of slow in the 20s and 30s. Obviously, these are older movies that, we're looking at modern day letterbox ratings for movies that came out 100 years ago. Obviously, there's going to be some biases to that. People generally like newer stuff. Even the film bros of the letterbox community, they generally gravitate towards things much newer than this. But it is our baseline. And as we can see, things get better and better from the 20s on through the 50s. Quality's just improving. And then the 60s and 70s, we reach our statistical peak. So, well, if you want to know when the best time for movies was, apparently it was the 1960s and 70s. So there you go. 80s and 90s and 2000s, we get a bit of a drop from there, but it's not too bad. Honestly, even up until the 2000s, we were still kind of in the normal range. The 2000s, it was a 3.43 average for the decade. Going back to the 40s, it was a 3.41. So we're, basically in that same sort of statistical range, as any other time in movie history. But then the 2010s and 2020s, I mean, it's just dropped off significantly. So are movies getting worse nowadays? Well, so far, the 2020s has been the worst decade in movies in history. Of course, again, we're only halfway through the decade, and the first part of the decade was mired by COVID and also the writers and actors strike that, rocked Hollywood for a while. So there was some time for us to recover this decade, but I don't think we're getting up into the highest of heights anytime soon. And even this decade being the worst one, the previous worst one was the 2010s, which, set the record for the worst decade in movies, beating out the previous one for 1920s. So the last 2 decades have been consecutively the worst in history. Now I've got a couple of timeline updates or things here. So the Hays Code, we overlay that. It was from the mid 30s to the late 60s, and this of course coincides with the time that movies were getting better. So, this is censorship, but I think that one thing that you can say for the Hays Code was that it taught filmmakers to have to be creative with their decisions. If you've got a set of rules and you have to follow them and work within the rules, and I think filmmakers got really good at working within these restrictions. And of course, when the Hays Code ends in 68, this coincides with the absolute peak where right after it ended, you still have all these disciplined filmmakers who have had to work within these restrictions, but now they have no restrictions, or at least much less restrictions. And so, they're able to really get creative and explore new things in movies that they couldn't before, but still with that expertise and discipline that they had built up over decades, which is why the late 60s and the 70s, You know, this is often called like a new wave of movies. Just statistically speaking, led to a lot of great movies. And of course, this other one here, streaming services. They started off kind of in the late 90s, and in the 2000s and 2010s they got more popular, and of course now they're more popular than ever. So this coincides, it seems, with the decline in movies. So are streaming services the issue? Of course, you could also make this the internet or social media. You could also say this is internet and social media. You know, this late 90s through today, it's gotten more and more ubiquitous. So is this causing a decline in movies? The reason why I got these things here is just to kind of point out some things that line up on the timeline, but we'll look at some other things first here. So this is just kind of a list of our green years, the really good years, and the red years. So one thing you'll notice about the green years, the 60s and 70s have the most. We had a couple in the 90s, but we haven't had a truly great year in movies, according to this data, for over 30 years. We've had some years that have come close to being great years, but nothing has truly been great since the early 90s, according to the statistics. And as far as bad years, well, the 20s and 30s had them for sure, but then mid-century, they really weren't too much of a thing. But since 2007, we've been having them quite regularly. We haven't had a longer than 4-year stretch since 2007 without having these red years. So, no green years since 1993, and a decreasing number of red years since 2007. We're having less great years for movies and more bad years for movies. I think maybe we're starting to see that the people who are saying that movies are getting worse had a point. If we look at this, 7 out of 8 of the best years in movies occurred in a 12-year period from 1968 through 1979. Here's the top 10 list for you there. But if you look at the top 8, 7 out of 8 of them occurred in this late 60s, early 70s period, which again, going back to what I said about the Hays Code ended in 68, which just so happens to coincide with the beginning of the best 12-year stretch in movie history. So, like I said, you've potentially got all these filmmakers who have gotten really good at working with restrictions, and now they have no restrictions, or much less restrictions, and they were able to really do some amazing things, it seems. And all of the top 6 worst years in movie histories are in 2 clusters: 3 consecutive years from 1929 to 31, and 3 consecutive years from 2019 through 2021. So you got the early talkie years and the COVID years. So, you see here, top 10 worst years. 1929, worst ever. 1930, third worst ever. 1931, tied for 5th. And then, of course, in modern times, 2019 is tied for 5th. 2020 is the 2nd worst ever. 2021 is the 4th worst ever. So, like I said, while movies generally, as you can see, you can have a lot of bad years regardless of the situation if the talent's just not there, or they're just not making that many great movies, or at least the audience aren't going to support that many great movies. There's another angle you could put, maybe there are really good movies, but if audiences just aren't supporting them, well then they're not going to show up in these statistics, because again, we're only tracking the biggest box office hits, and the biggest box office hits are just they're suffering. But as we can see here with these clusters, they do coincide with some external factors that definitely made things a lot worse. And this chart here, it shows, I think, what a lot of people are going to blame as a potential culprit. So first off, great movies. Remember, this is movies that have a 3.9 or better rating, and awful movies have a 2.9 or worse rating. If we look at this orange line, this is tracking the number of great movies, and the yellow line tracking the number of awful movies. In the 20s and 30s, there were more awful movies at the top of the box office than there were great movies. But then in the 40s, we see an inversion of this. Really, this inversion happened in the late 30s. It's just that the early 30s were so overwhelmingly bad that it skewed the data. But okay, so late 30s through the 50s, it inverts. We have more great movies at the top of the box office than awful movies, which I think we can all agree is the way that it should be. Then it peaks in the 60s and 70s, where this gap between great and awful is at its highest. Then in the 80s, 90s, and 2000s, the gap shrinks, but it's still there. We still have more great movies than awful movies, at least at the top of the box office. And then in the 2010s and 2020s, it inverts again, where we have more awful movies than great movies. And so, why is this? Well, we have talked about potentially streaming services or social media before being a culprit. You know, perhaps people just aren't as interested in supporting great movies anymore in the box office when we have all these other distractions. Like, you know, why would you go out to a theater to watch a movie when you can just watch it at home? That's obviously going to skew things, but also, this is sort of the age-old reason why people give for why movies are not as good anymore: the number of franchise movies. So these are sequels and remakes and reboots. As you can see, I mean, they've always been there. Even as far back as the 1920s, we had sequels. And from the 1920s through the 1960s, it was, you know, relatively the same. You know, about 10% of box office hits, plus or minus. So, you know, maybe one a year would be a franchise movie. But then in the 70s, again, I mean, remember, we're saying that the 70s was potentially the peak for movie quality, but we see a big jump in the number of franchise movies. In the 70s, 80s, and 90s, it goes from, you know, 10% historically up to 20 to 30%. So we're starting to see more franchises by this point. But still, I think we can all say that, 2 to 3 sequels a year getting into the top 10, that wouldn't actually be that bad. I think we can all live with that. But then the 2000s, I mean, things just start skyrocketing. We're above 50% sequels and remakes in the 2000s, and then above 80% in the 2010s. In the 2020s, so far, we're looking at about 90%. 90% of box office hits, 9 out of 10 movies that are making, you know, topping the charts, at least in the US box office, they're sequels. They're reboots. So, while we can say that, alright, they're not making movies like they used to, really, you know, this is our fault. We're supporting more and more sequels as time goes on, obviously. I mean, we can all lambaste sequels, bad sequels, all we want, but at the end of the day, this is us. This is our doing. We're supporting this. So, some conclusions. According to the data, while not every individual movie is bad, the overall trend is downward. I think we see this clearly. Yes, things have been getting bad, worse and worse for the last 50 years, really. So, the early talkie and COVID era seem to be the worst time in cinema history. These are external factors. You know, not much that the movie industry could have done to avoid that. I mean, the first one is kind of self-inflicted, but, you know, this was, I guess you could say, growing pains. And of course, COVID, well, I mean, it's COVID. No one could, do anything about that. That was just the best we could do. So, the 60s and 70s, the post-Hays era, seemed to be the best time in cinema history, and as average ratings have been falling, the number of franchise films have been rising, and this is probably not a coincidence. Of course, there's blame to go around for this. It's partly studios' fault for, only greenlighting these things, but it's also partly our fault for continuing to watch these unoriginal movies instead of watching original movies. So our potential culprits: lack of originality, there's more sequels and less original stories. Again, partly our fault. We're the ones watching these. We're the ones who control the box office with our own dollars, which is essentially our votes. But yes, there are more sequels, which of course means less originality. Lack of discipline. Movies were at their peak, were at their best, just after the Hays Code restrictions were lifted, when filmmakers were still disciplined from having to work within the old restrictive framework, but now have the freedom to explore new material. So there's, all these filmmakers who have gotten so good within the old Hays Code restrictive system. Now restrictions are lifted, and there's just this burst of creativity that lasted for about a decade or so. And this is when cinema seems to have peaked, according to the data. And then competition from other media. Streaming services, video games, social media, these all leech talent away from traditional movie making. I mean, why would you want to go and be an actor in Hollywood when you could just turn on your computer and sit on your butt at home and, be a Vtuber, for instance? Hi, that's me. I'm part of the problem, apparently. I should have been an actor. I don't think I would be a very good actor, but hey, I guess I'm part of the problem. I watch too many sequels, and I'm on social media. So, there you have it. If you came into this thinking that movies are worse now than ever, well, then you would be partly correct, because the 2020s have indeed been the worst time for movies. But, as we've discussed, there are potentially many reasons for this. It's not just as simple as, Hollywood is dumb and stupid and they can't make anything quality anymore. I'm not saying that's wrong. I'm not saying that Hollywood doesn't have its issues these days, but I think it's a little bit more complicated than that. Again, like I said, you've got all this competition from other sources of media that drains talent from this one traditional medium of, cinema and movies. It's the talent has to spread out. There's only so much talent to go around. And also, we're funding this, literally, by continuing to go to see more sequels and remakes and all that, as opposed to good original stories, which, let's be honest, a lot of the best original stuff, it's being made outside of cinema, outside of the movies. Just look at what Glitch is doing with, all their series, like Murder Drones and The Amazing Digital Circus and all that. There's a lot of talent there, but it's not going to the movies. It's going to, these essentially TV series, but it's on social media. It's on YouTube. So the real takeaway from all this is that the landscape of entertainment is changing. I don't think we're ever going to get back to the peak cinema that we had way back in the day with, the 70s. Movies just aren't going to return to what they were, but that may not necessarily be the worst thing, because there's still a lot of creativity going on. It's just not necessarily always at the movies. So, thank you for watching. I hope that this was somewhat enlightening and perhaps entertaining or educational, whatever. I hope you got something out of this video. Please like and subscribe if you think I deserve it, and I will see you later then. Bye.